Welcome, everybody. It's just about a minute before 3 o'clock. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Dan Stark, and I'm an OSU FNR Extension Agent for Clatsop, Tillamook, and Lincoln counties. I'm excited to be your host for today's Tree School online webinar. Tree School Online is a production of the OSU Forestry and Natural Resources Extension Program and the Partnership for Forestry Education. We want to give special recognition to the Oregon Forest Resources Institute for leading this project, and to the U.S. Forest Service and the Oregon Department of Forestry for giving us a grant to cover our expenses. Please visit the Tree School online page on the knowyourforest.org website for updates on recent recordings, as well as access to the whole library of previous recordings. A little bit of housekeeping details, as usual, if you've been on our Tree School Online before. The Zoom toolbar should be located at the bottom of your screen. If you don't see it, scroll your cursor over this area and it should pop up. On some hardware, such as on iPads, the Zoom toolbar is on top of the display. Many features can be accessed from the toolbar. The audio is muted for participants unless unmuted by the host. The video is not available for participants. Your written questions should be posted in the Q&A chat box listed below. I will be monitoring this throughout the webinar. We are asking that all of your questions for our presenters be written in the Q&A box. We are not able to take spoken questions. That chat box down there should only be used if you're having problems. So don't put your questions in there. We'll have to mine them out if you do. This is for technical issues. This will be monitored throughout. Let's see, that's right, okay. Chat can also be used to send messages to panelists and participants, either individually or as a group if you need to reach us for any reason. All the resources shared during today's webinar can be found on the Tree School Online class guide page, which you can easily reach from the Tree School Online page on the knowyourforest.org website. Click on the webinar description, then look for the webinar you're looking for. Immediately above each webinar description is a link to instructor resources. Webinars are being recorded. They will be archived as YouTube videos and be accessible from the Tree School Online page. Polling will be used during this webinar at the beginning and in the middle, and an evaluation poll will be posted near the end of the webinar. We actually don't have a poll in the middle of the presentation today, so just at the beginning and the end. Polls should pop up on your screen in a box. After you answer the questions, you'll have about a minute to do so. The poll can be closed. If you don't see the polls, check in the Zoom toolbar for a lighted button. If the button appears, the poll should pop up when you press it. Okay, I'm going to move on now to introducing our speakers. I have the pleasure of introducing for you today Chal Landgren, Chal, and Judy Kowalski. I'm going to start with our second speaker first today, Judy Kowalski. Judy has been a biological science technician in the statewide Christmas tree program located at the North Willamette Research and Extension Center since 2008. She has almost 20 years of experience working with a variety of crops, including berries, ornamental nursery plants, as well as Christmas trees. She assists with educational events and all aspects of research projects at the NWREC, that's the North Willamette Research and Extension Center, and at grower cooperator sites as well. And on to our first speaker then, Chal Landgren. Professor Landgren has served as Extension Christmas Tree Specialist at Oregon State University since 2008, when the position was created by the state legislature. His work is a mix of education, programming, applied research, and publishing. Research projects include foliar fertilization, genetic improvement and testing of Douglas fir and true firs, including Noble, Nordman, Turkish, and Trojan, seed orchard development, various insect disease control projects, sustainability certification, and seedling survival experiments. He works closely with growers, farm advisors, and researchers across the Pacific Northwest. He has national and international collaboration projects utilizing plant growth regulators and leader length control of true fir Christmas trees, Along with colleagues, Professor Landgren has international seed collection trips to Turkey and the Republic of Georgia. Active in his international professional organization, UFRO, and I forgot to look that up. You're going to have to write what all those letters mean. I've attended. Chal, you can tell them what that means. It's the International Forestry Conference, I know, but so many acronyms, I've forgotten what that one stands for. You're a part of this, active member of this international profession, and has served as past chairman of the Christmas Tree Working Group and is a regular conference contributor. His list of publications and videos include numerous extension guides covering a diverse range of tree growing topics, along with grower and research journal articles. Professor Landgren has worked for Oregon State Extension Service since 1980, also serving as an extension forester and staff chair in Washington County. He has worked and lived internationally in Norway, Denmark, and British Columbia. In addition, Professor Landgren has been involved in Christmas trees since planting, managing, and selling trees on his small family farm outside of Portland since 1982. Okay, Chal, if you want to go ahead and start, you have your slide up there. You're going to go ahead and introduce your slide for us, and then we're going to have a quick poll.
Thank you, Dan, and that stands for International Union of Forest Research.
There it is. Thank you.
So, pleasure to be here with all of you today. It was a surprise out here in Beaverton to wake up to an inch of snow and hearing all the junior high school kids trying to have their first accident and trip to the emergency room. So that was quite a surprise. And we're going to be talking about a long history of some research and trials, but in a good way. I'll be presenting the first part, and then Judy Kowalski will take over the second part. And if I can get my slides to change, I'll be very excited.
Great. And while you're doing that, we're going to go ahead and run the first poll. So on your screen, then, your first poll should appear. And I have to remember where I put that on my computer. I had it up. There we go. Okay, here is our opening poll then. If you've been to Tree School Online, you're quite familiar with this poll. We like to ask this of every group. If you're new to Tree School Online, you can just click and answer these. Your response is unanimous. You have about a minute here. So simple question, where are you from? Then you have some questions here. Willamette Valley area, these are answers. Willamette Valley area, coastal Oregon, Southwest Oregon, Central or Eastern Oregon, Washington State, USA, or outside of the USA. Question 2 is about yourself. Are you a woodland owner, a private natural resource professional, an agency natural resource professional, a nonprofit natural resources professional, or an other? Question number 3 of 4, how many acres of forest land do you own or manage? That could be 0, 10 acres or less. A little over 10 to 40 acres, or over 40 acres to 100, over 100 to 1,000 acres, or over 1,000 acres. Oh, I guess we have 3 polls today. 3 questions and not 4. Okay, you have just a little bit more time here. Looks like people are still rolling in. Okay, thank you for participating. Oh, there's one more. Okay, I'm going to close it off. Last chance. Okay, I just go ahead and I ended that poll. Okay, so those results now should be up on your screen. So as far as where you all are from and where you're tuning in from today, USA is popular at 38%. Tied for that is the Willamette Valley area. We have some folks from the Coastal Range and from Southwest Oregon and also from Washington State. Welcome, everybody. No one from outside of the USA today. A little bit about yourself. Most folks here look like they are woodland owners. We do have some folks from who are agency and natural resource professionals, and we have a few others also. Okay, so in terms of the amount of acres of forest land you own or manage, right around 10 acres or less is mostly where this group is hovering around. And then we do have a couple people who are over 100 to 1,000. And a couple people who don't own any. So that's fantastic. Thank you all for participating. And with that, I'm going to mute myself and hand it back over to Chal, and I'll see you back in the middle. We ask that you ask those questions again for of our speakers while in the Q&A question box down below. And there'll be time for Q&A at the end. Thank you, everybody.
All right. We're ready to go. So wanted to start out with just an overview of what we're going to be talking about today. On this first segment, about 45 minutes, half hour, I'll be talking about some media questions from this Christmas season, review some past experiments and talk about some new ones, briefly talk about what we're doing to refill my position. I have retired and I've been working half time. So talk about that for a minute. Second segment, we'll be handing over to Judy. She will talk about Coforge 1 and 2, and we often use these abbreviations, and that's the Coforge stands for Cooperative Fur Germplasm Evaluation Project. And Judy's also going to talk a little bit about the heat dome that we've all suffered through. So that's the way I'd like to organize our time today. So talk a little bit about some observations that I've had over the last few years. Skipped one slide, but maybe we can get back to it. Wanted to talk a little bit about the news that we've had this year for Christmas trees. The last 3 weeks have been very busy with calls from media, newspapers, magazines, and blog posts. The questions that most of them were asking were about the damage that we had this year in Christmas trees and forest plantings. The hard part of answering these questions was a lot of the reporters couldn't distinguish between seedlings and harvest trees. And so people were suggesting that we had 70% of our noble fir was all burnt up and dying, not knowing that we were talking about seedlings that were planted this season rather than harvest trees. And as usual, newspapers were looking for anything sensational, wanted to get information on how much folks were going to have to pay for Christmas trees and whether or not there's going to be enough trees and whether fake trees were taking over. So that was kind of the news for this last season. So switch bases to talk a little bit about some observations that I've had over the last 40 years on problem solving. And I scratched out the word research, use that in more formal settings rather than problem solving, which is really what I think a lot of us do, because it's very focused, applied research looking at grower problems. And these are just a few observations I'd make over the last 40 years. The location of your farm makes a huge difference in looking at progeny tests for probably for the last 30 years. If you've got a good location and a good site, you probably can harvest the trees almost 2 years sooner than the grower that might be on a poorer site. Also, the trees that look bad on the more poor site probably look pretty good on the better sites. So location makes a huge difference in Christmas tree growing and in forestry as well. Often just identifying the problem is about the best anyone can do. And if you can get a good identification of what the disease or insect or growing problem is, that's often as good as it gets. Scale makes a difference in the types of solutions that you have. Some of the larger growers, if they can't have a helicopter do some of the work, it probably won't get done. And that's not an option that a lot of us small growers have. Whereas we can do a lot more individual tree caring and looking at some other some other possibilities that some of the larger growers aren't able to look at. Innovation comes from all corners of our industry. A lot of the trials and experiments that Judy and I have been working on and others come from growers. So growers, keep up the good work and certainly let us know what the problems are that you're seeing out there that we hopefully can work with you on. Ideas are a good start. Funding and staff are kind of the next step on getting to solve a lot of the problems that we've identified. The best solutions that we have rely on many colleagues, multiple disciplines, and interested growers. What I'm going to be presenting here this morning, or this afternoon rather, are solutions that have been worked on for lots of people, certainly not just myself. Rick Fletcher, Mike Bondi, Gary Chastagner, Judy, John Hart, Ken Brown, many growers, Steve Webster, have helped with developing these solutions. One of the difficulties in talking about solutions to problems is that there can be decades or more between when we first identify the problem and when we have some sort of an operational solution. So, for example, we might be talking about some of the best genetic sources that we've tested, but it also is probably going to be about 10 to 15 years before we have seed from those best sources available to growers. So there's this temporal disconnect, if you will, from just identifying the problem and testing to finding solutions. A lot of growers and all of us look at, just because a product might work on tomato plants, don't assume it's going to work on Christmas trees. In many cases, it won't. So we get a lot of ideas from other growers, but it needs to be tested first. And if a grower is claiming that something works, we want to make sure that they've thought about looking at control strategies, whether or not they have really tested that product to know that it actually does work. We also don't want to forget the consumer. A lot of times growers can get caught up in trying to produce the ultimate perfect tree and forget that it weighs too much to get in the car, or it's too wide for the house, or consumers don't appreciate all of the extra work that you've done. So let's talk about some of these problems and some of the research issues that have gone on with them. Start out with some of these weird problems that we hope to never see again. In the upper left is a condition that was called web blight of Rhizoctonia, binucleate Rhizoctonia. But it showed up at 3 growers' farms in the Willamette Valley, and it produced these blank spots on trees of all different species in the middle of winter. So it was a problem that came on about 3 years ago. We developed some testing strategies to look at some sprays that we were going to put on at different times. We had 1 year to do that, and then the problem seemingly went away. So we hope that it stays absent. But this was one of those problems that you think the world is coming to an end, and it was a problem that we kind of fixed itself, I guess. Another one is the lower left corner. It's kind of called purple needle eater, Delphinella, and causes the new growth to turn purple and fall off. So again, we worked on 2 years worth of control strategies with some spray projects, figured out some sprays and timings that worked, and then the problem kind of disappeared. Judy's going to talk about heat domes, so I'll skip that. Lucky for us, a lot of these have gone away fairly quickly. Some of the experiments that we've tried over the years that weren't as successful as we might have liked. Spent 3 years working on drone surveys, and the ideas there were that we were going to inventory fields and check on tree health. It was very exciting, but we were likely too early in the process. If we'd have started it right now, when a lot of more drones are available, we crashed the drone, I think, 2 or 3 times. Had to jump through a lot of FAA hoops to do anything, and ended up being able to fly over fields and get some wonderful pictures. But I think we were a little too early in the adoption of that. Growers now are using these to do some of the things that we were working with 3 or 4 years ago. Also worked on a number of tools to measure tree health and tree decline. Those were exciting, but a lot of the tools were pretty expensive for growers, and we realized that the human eye actually was pretty good at detecting a lot of these problems, and not quite as expensive. A couple of growers that had problems with rain beetles, and we looked at controls that were using nematodes and root injections with insecticides. Those are often very difficult to know if the project worked or it didn't work. Digging up rain beetles and counting nematodes and injecting insecticides is really hard to tell if you're being effective or not. Like to think we did some good, but it's again one of these experiments that's hard to really know. Some of the issues and problems that will be likely with us as growers for a long period of time, but we've had experiments that have been helping. So I'll talk a little bit about current season needle necrosis. That's what those sets of initials stands for. Talk about needle midge, twig weevil, slugs, scarab beetles, and rain beetles, Monosis root rot, and Phytophthora pretty briefly. With current season needle necrosis, it's been a problem that's been with us for as long as I've heard about growing trees. It was kind of a mystery about the cause at first, and it's still a bit of an unknown puzzle. But some of the things that we have learned is that it's under strong genetic control. You can see one family of trees that will be very heavily impacted by needle necrosis, and the tree right next to it will be impacted hardly at all. And this is a genetic test plot that we had up in the Puyallup area, where we were identifying individual trees and families of trees of noble fir that we could find some that repeatedly had needle necrosis and some that didn't get it, even though the others did. The other thing that we've learned about needle necrosis is that site is critical. If you have a low elevation bottomland valley site and you're growing grand fir, you're likely to be very familiar with this disorder. We've tested lots of treatments. We found that shade works and calcium chloride sprays help. We've tried various needle protection, needle shade type products, and none of those have been consistently effective. So can't say we've had success there, but we've tested a lot of different things. There's also quite a bit of difference between the major species that we grow. Nordman, Turkish fir don't often get this problem. Grand fir is a species that gets it regularly. Noble fir is kind of in between. Needle midge. This is a insect pest that we've done a lot of work with over the years. Entomologists have helped us greatly learning about the time to spray and the spray efforts with looking at traps and sticky tabs and better scouting. So we've learned over the years to know when the best time to time the spraying is. There's work been going on with biological control of this pest, and Dave Shaw has a master's student from Turkey that's working on some of the biological control of this insect pest this year. We've been able to develop some degree day models with the help from some of the growers that have been very effective in terms of timing when to do the spraying if you need it. We've been testing new insecticides to look at which are the most effective. And we've been a lot more kind of discerning about the need to spray. So a lot of growers have not been spraying on pre-harvest trees and knowing kind of on their own fields when the problem's big enough to actually needing to spray. So that's a summary of needle midge. Slugs is an interesting pest. It's not so much a domestic pest of trees. They've always been there, but if we want to ship trees to Hawaii, that's a problem. They'll find one slug on a back of a container and the whole load could be rejected. So one of the growers wanted to institute a water bath to see if he could run the trees through a bath of water and kill slugs. And the question then became, how long do the trees need to be underwater and how hot does the water need to be? So we had some experiments where we put slugs, in little bags on trees, ran them through the water bath and looked to see at the end of the day whether or not we were effective in controlling the slugs so they could be imported into Hawaii. Some other slug work, and Judy's very familiar with this, is where we worked with Rory McDonald from OSU in research and trying to find out which slugs are actually in the fields, whether they're only on the ground or whether they're up in the trees themselves. So we had 10 noble fir plantations and 6 holding yards that were tested for over a year with these mats and tree tapes. So Rory's results are summarized here, and certainly don't expect anyone to memorize all this information, but 3 of the species were actually ones that were restricted in entry into Hawaii. So it was good to know that those were some that we were finding, but they weren't all that prevalent. What growers can do, and some of the work that Rory and others worked on were, if you're cutting trees, make sure there's a minimum time that the trees are on the ground after cutting. Keep the trees on pallets as long as you can. Some of the baiting in the yards has been helpful, and then shaking and moving the debris away from the trees once they have been shaken have been helpful on reducing the amount of slugs that you'll find. A big disease problem on Christmas trees, particularly some of our noble fir, is Phytophthora. And this is just the picture on the right is just sort of showing the effects of this disease on trees. So the purple areas are the only parts of those trees that are able to conduct water. So that's in the xylem. The cambium layers that are all darkened have been killed by this particular root rot, and the tissue near the cambium in the xylem hasn't been able to conduct water. So the tree will eventually die, but a lot of people have been working on this disease for a number of years, and we found that there is differential resistance to our Phytophthora species among the commonly planted trees. So you can have a field of maybe noble fir or Shasta fir that are dying from root rot areas, and plant something like Turkish fir and get a successful plantation growing. We've also done a lot of identification so that we know what Phytophthora species we have in our fields. We've got better identification tools to identify that Phytophthora is indeed the problem. In field situations, there's very few controls that have been effective, even though there are a few that have been working in nurseries. But improving drainage does help. But this is a problem that will be ongoing for, I'm sure, many of our careers. Anosis root rot is another one that spent a lot of time working with. Some of the things that have been identified to help kind of mitigate this problem is there are dangers planting next to old stumps. So if you've had a previous plantation where there were trees dying and you plant your next rotation right next to those stumps, you can be asking for problems. We've had tools to better identify this disease and trials looking at field preparation where we've compared stump removal and grinding and rotating into different species. So some of those have been very effective in minimizing subsequent plant, rotations from anosis root rot. So we've made some strides in reducing the amount of anosis root rot you'll have in the next rotations. Swiss needle cast is one that we started working on just when I was starting with Oregon State University. And I think it's one of these success stories that we seldom think about because growers pretty well now have a pretty good handle on how to deal with this problem. A major concern in the 80s on Douglas fir. Significant research went on at OSU and WSU long before it was recognized as a major problem in the forests. Sprays were tested along with timing of sprays and other control strategies. So most growers now can pretty well deal with Swiss needlecast in their plantation and know how to identify it and control for that problem. Some experiments that have worked very well that we've worked on for a long period of time. One of them is looking at plant growth regulators to control leader length. This has probably been one that I've worked on the longest. And thanks to Denmark and OSU extension agents and many growers, I think we finally got some solutions to control leader length. We now have a registered product with consistent results. The product is ConShape, Valent Bioscience product. We know a rate that's effective, and it's about 250 to 300 mils per liter. We can apply it when the liter is 2 inches in length and keep it from getting too long on Noble, Nordman, and Turkish fir. And that's just a picture of rolling the liter at one of our trials. Some of the projects that have gone on over the last probably 30 years as experiments on when to cut tops, how to straighten tops, using less lethal controls for common aphid problems, seedling survival strategies, how well does shaking work to remove pests, how long and how hot these water baths need to be to kill slugs. Had a trial with the Department of Agriculture, just looking at what pests are out in the fields and which ones do we know and which ones do we need to know about. The winter insecticide sprays kill yellow jackets. The quick answer is no. But that was an interesting project where we had to bag yellow jackets and put them in trees and have them helicopters spray to see if we could control yellow jackets in the field. Calcium applications and a number of experiments that we've been working on over the last 30 years. And this is just some pictures of a few of those. One of the growers spraying elemental sulfur to see if we could control Swiss needlecast with elemental sulfur. Found out we couldn't, and we can make the trees smell really bad. This is on the right, a trial looking at whether some of these anti-transparent sprays can keep the trees lasting longer at Christmas, and the answer was no. So we set up some trials in the greenhouse to test that idea. New products to test. We've been looking at controls for balsam woolly adelgid with some insecticides. Root aphid control, we lost a chemical called Aphistar. So we needed to do some tests with some newer products to see if they would work, and found out that they did. Aphid controls with closer and transform a new insecticide that is probably going to be one that is replacing Lorsban, algae control, and we've done a lot of work with different herbicides, and that's just a list of some of those that we've been testing over the last many years. Some of them never made it to market, and some are now products that are commonly used in Christmas tree plantations. One of the products or projects rather that we had help from a lot of student interns and others is looking at whether we could do biocontrols for aphids. And so the species that, tends to get a lot of aphid damage is grand fir. So we worked on releasing biocontrol agents like lacewings, ladybugs, Aphidoleides midge, Adelphus wasp, and predalure units to try to that were trying to lure the predators into the trees. We also tested biological insecticides to see how effective they could be. And we evaluated in-field plantings and existing pollinator plants in fields to see how effective they could be in trying to utilize biological control agents to control aphids. Seedling survival trials, mentioned that earlier. With the dry, hot summers that we've been having, we've been doing a number of trials looking at things we can do to get trees to survive these long, hot summers. In this 2018 trial, we used Root-Tex Moisture Lock and some tree shades, which are pictured on that lower right. And in this trial, it was the tree shades that were the most effective in increasing the survivability of noble fir. Had some other treatments again in 2019, where we used a number of products where we were dipping the trees in various solutions that growers had suggested they thought might work. In this trial, we added the shades and we added mulch as a treatment, wood chips, and compared those with some of these other root dips. At another site, we used some vitamin dips, vitamin B1 root dips. We had a polymer that was injected at the roots, and we had shades and an untreated check included. 2019 wasn't as dry a year as we've been used to, but in these trials, we found that the most effective thing that we have tried has been the coarse wood chip mulch at the base of the tree that improves survival. So that's one that we'll be doing some further testing on with this next year. So the mulch, kind of the wood chip mulch, we had a 20% better survival this last year in some trials that we continued. So that seems to be the most effective, and we're going to be looking at comparing this with some other treatments this next year. Some long-term kind of strategic research that I'll just briefly go over. We've been working on tree improvement for 40 years. Long-term site productivity has been a very interesting project. Foliar fertilization, seed orchard, cone stimulation for noble fir, and nutrient management and testing, which lasted 5 years. I'll just briefly go through some of these noble fir trials, but the ones that I've been working with started in 1996. We were looking at some BLM trees from the BLM on the Coast Range. We had brought in some trees, some seed from Denmark, and we were testing those against some Riley-Fano crosses that had been identified earlier. In 2000, we had a trial where we had 27 families. We brought in some additional BLM sources from the coast. We tested some US Forest Service seed from the Cascades, turned out to be horrible. And we did some Riley-Fano testing with noble fir. In 2001 and 2004, we had some additional trials. And And what we were finding through these trials in 2001 and 2004 was that some of the BLM sources from the Coast Range were some of the best that we'd ever tested. We tested some additional sources from Stock Mountain, and they were looking really promising. We had a test in 2005 and 2007. We found in those that some of our space trees from the Hostetler orchard that were just outstanding trees that growers grafted into a seed orchard, those were doing very, very well. The orchard was old enough to produce seed, and we started to test some of those. And so some of these the space trees that we call them were some of the most outstanding trees that we tested in those trials. Douglas firs has gone through some similar progeny testing examples. So we've had tests from 1991 on, and we found some very promising sources from Canada, from Tuxedo Island. We had some Siuslaw National Forest sources that did very well, and some individual trees from growers' plantations that we liked and grafted into the orchard. They're looking really promising. And Douglas fir. For Nordman and Turkish firs, we've had trials now from 1999 through this last year, and we'll be watching those very carefully to look at which of those sources do well. In general, we found that the Turkish seem to be growing a little faster, and those have been very promising. The purpose of all of this testing is to get these trees grafted into orchards. And the picture on the right is Mark Schmidlin and his grandson doing some cone picking up at the Barney Douglas orchard. And the upper right-hand picture now is some individuals grafting sources for our seed orchard at North Willamette and others, and some of development of the seed orchards that we've got going. And these are just some pictures of some seed orchards at North Willamette. We have a number of seed orchards on growers' property around the Northwest. The picture on the lower left is one of Trojan fir, and that's probably one of the few Trojan fir orchards in the world, because that's a new species, and Judy may talk a little bit about that later. And we've got Douglas fir on the right and some Turkish fir up in the upper left. Long-term productivity, just briefly talk about some of the results from looking at some problems that growers identified in long-term productivity. So as growers move to multiple rotations on the same ground of Christmas trees, growers started raising concerns about whether the fourth rotation was as productive as the first rotation. So we had a long-term study where we looked at pH, nutrients, soil carbon, atrazine and Velpar residues, aggregate stability, and soil density. So we had various paired plots that were put in from, I think from probably Chehalis all the way down to near Eugene, that on grower sites that we compared first rotation fields to third and fourth rotation fields on the same ground, or near each other, and trying to look for whether there was some long-term productivity problems. So the results of that study were that we were not finding any widespread decline that was uniform across all sites. Some sites needed some treatments in that they were developing some problems with compaction and aggregate stability. Other sites have been restored by tillage and cover crops and other means, and the fourth rotation was seemingly just as productive as the first. So that was a very interesting project to work on over those many, many years. Nutrient management is a project or a program that we've worked in since probably the 80s. When we look back, we kind of forget that in the 80s, we were guessing about what nutrient levels that were normal in Christmas trees. We didn't have many testing protocols. We didn't know much about fertilizer timing and amounts to apply. So a lot of growers were encouraging us to do work on nutrient management. And so over a 5 or 6 year period, John Hart led us in a project where we developed some protocols that were effective on Christmas trees. We've been kind of using some treatments that were helpful in filberts and shade trees, but we developed some conifer specific treatments, and those have been very, very helpful, I think, to growers over the years in working on their timing of fertilizer applications and knowing how to do testing and field preparation for effective nutrient management on our most commonly grown species. Foliar fertilization was a project that had us looking at whether or not it made sense to be fertilizing conifers with foliar sprays, foliar nutrients. And after a 4-year study looking at greenhouse and field trials, the bottom line conclusion was that they were not particularly effective on conifers, except for adding some micronutrients, and were much more expensive. So many of the growers that had been doing those foliar fertilizer trials abandoned those and went back to just doing soil applied fertilizers. So that was, again, looking at it at a specific grower identified issue or problem. Trying to get conifer trees to produce cones, particularly noble fir, has been an issue in all of our seed orchards. And at 3 different sites, this was probably almost 15 years ago, we looked at combinations of gibberellic acid injections and girdling of the trees to see if we could encourage noble fir to produce seed and cones. So after many months of working on different strategies to get to test out, we found that we did improve cone production on one orchard, but we had little impact on some of the older orchards. And this is just a picture of, on the lower right, of some of the people that had been very helpful in working on the trial up at the Barney Douglas seed orchard. So some of the continuing research that's going on is Dr. Gary Chastagner has been working with seed imports with Chal detections. So we've been working with twig weevil controls and improving long-term storage of Turkish and Nordman fir seed. I won't have time to go into those in any particular depth, but just be aware that these are projects that are going to be ongoing up at WSU. The seed chalcid issue is one that we're looking at temperature with imported seed, trying to see if there's a temperature at which we can kill the chalcid without damaging the seed. So we can get imports from Georgia or Turkey or Denmark successfully into the country. Twig weevil's been an issue, certainly on a number of grower sites, and we've been looking at some spray strategies and testing some different spray strategies and timing and trying to see which ones are the most effective. Long-term storage of Turkish and Nordman fir and Trojan seed has been an issue that we're looking at various moisture levels of seed and temperatures to see if we can get Turkish and Nordman and Trojan fir seed to store longer than we've been able to do in the past. So those are some ongoing ones. Then I mentioned this in 2022, submitted a proposal to look at seedling survival. The grant that we submitted was going to be looking at using wood chips, and we're going to be testing some some products from Helena and Wilbur Ellis, fertilizer products that we're going to be spraying on the roots as they're planted. We've had some promising results at one site in 2021. So we're going to be trying to follow up if we can improve seedling survival and maybe growth. So that might be a project coming next year. And before turning it over to Judy, I just want to go through a little bit about where we're at in terms of refilling my position at OSU. I've been working half-time this last year after retiring in the prior year. I hope to keep working 1 day a week in 2022. We've been lucky to Judy's will be able to work full-time in 2022, this next year. We're working right now on an industry needs assessment that will be completed by the first of the year to help kind of guide the position in terms of what are the most important needs of the industry and what problems are growers seeing that they would like help with. The Christmas Tree Associations form grower committees in Oregon and Washington that will be working with university leadership and the legislature to help on refilling my position. And those kinds of things will probably be, you'll find them on our website when we know anything about the possibilities about refilling positions, which OSU's been not able to fill a lot of positions in the recent past, that we're hoping that'll be changing. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Judy, and I think that there were going to be some questions.
Yeah, thank you, Chal. That was fantastic. We have a few minutes while we're transitioning to Judy's talk. So there were a couple questions here in the box I'd like to just bring up here. And if you just give me 1 second. We did have, let me see, I'm going to just post this right here. Okay, let me get that in our chat box. Okay. So I did just post that reference for that video that you shared in your reference there. And just a reminder, all of the references that are shared in today's webinar will be available for you. And there are some resources for you online. So our questions are there's one in particular that has to do with, growing, where to grow, what is a good site and a bad site. And so I went ahead and put together this growing Christmas, or posted the growing Christmas trees in the Pacific Northwest, which is a guide for the prospective and novice Christmas tree grower. Would you agree, Chal and Judy, that that's probably a good site to see, like, what site to choose and, like that kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, it's easy to say, you want to grow trees on a good site and avoid the bad sites. But if you've got a site that's deep, well-drained volcanic soil on the north slope with 50 inches of rainfall, you're probably at a pretty good location. If you're in the valley with 30 inches of rainfall on a soil that isn't very well drained, you're stuck in trying to deal probably with a lot of problems. So somewhere in between is where a lot of the growth takes place, but site makes a huge difference.
Great. And we did have some questions in advance. And so I posted another reference there. I hope you don't mind. They had some questions about whether this talk was going to be, if we were going to address, how to shape the trees. These folks were do things they had described as more natural. And so they're having problems hanging the ornaments on the trees for that reason. So they're wondering about kind of those cultural controls. And so I did share the developing quality Christmas trees in the Pacific Northwest by you all. So is that a good place for them to find that information?
Yeah, and there's also some videos that are a little old now, but they're still relevant, that you can find on the Extension Catalog website that relate to Douglas fir and noble fir, that'll at least talk about the principles of how to culture trees. So those are good, useful guides.
Okay, Fantastic. We did have someone who was interested in seeing your slide again, Chal, about the con shape. So we can address that in a follow-up. I have access to that information too. So probably specific to what that product was. Okay,
Sure.
that's all we have for now. There is a time at the end too. I just want to remind everybody to ask questions of both of our speakers. Right now, I'm going to turn it over to Judy, who's going to take it away for us until our next Q&A session. Thank you, Judy.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to get my presentation up here and hopefully get it in the mode I need to get it in. I think it's taken a little while. There we go. So, yes, everybody can hear me fine, I'm assuming. So I'm going to start right in with continuing the 40 years of Christmas tree experimenting. I haven't been there for the whole time with Chal. I've been here for about the last 12 years, and I've been here for the whole time for the Coforge trial, which he kind of previewed you a little bit about. So I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to also talk about some of the results and outcomes from the Pacific Northwest sites that we had, and then what's next with the Coforge 2 trial. Then I'm going to go into a little bit about the heat dome that everybody probably knows about. So moving right along, Chal already told you about the Coforge project and what it exactly stands for. Collaborative for Germplasm Evaluation Project. So it's a collaboration of university extension faculty and researchers and the Christmas tree associations that go along with those regional areas. We're evaluating Turkish and Trojan fir species for use as Christmas trees across the major regions of the US and in Denmark. So those major regions are Connecticut, Michigan, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and then the Pacific Northwest. And we did include Denmark in there. So it all started with the seed collection, and the team of the people listed there was led by Dr. John Frampton of North Carolina State University, along with his colleague Ferret Isik, I believe is how you pronounce his name. And of course, Dr. Gary Chastegner of WSU and Chal. They headed out to Turkey and met up with a guide there who knew the area and had climbers and a crew to help collect cones. So they went to 5 collection areas with various elevations throughout northwestern Turkey. The areas in the lower left there, that I'm not even going to try and pronounce the whole name, so I'm going to use the abbreviations. Kan and the Kazdagi, those were the 2 stands that they collected Trojan fir in, and the Kan area had some of the lowest elevations, and then the Kazdagi had the higher elevation for the Trojan fir. Then up towards more towards Russia, we had the 3 other regions, and the Karabakh and the Akazi, and Chal could correct me, but were similar elevation areas, and Bolu was the highest. And those 3, they collected Turkish fir seeds in. So what they did is they collected from 20 trees in each of these 5 areas. And they had the climbers either climb or cut the trees down, and they, with the goal of getting at least 60 cones. And I think they were pretty successful on that endeavor. They got plenty of seed. So they also took lots of notes about the mother trees that they collected from, very detailed, where they found them, phenology, color, diseases, any branching structures, on and on, any distinguishing features they noted for record keeping, and who knows what you might need that for. But so that was the collection area. The timeline goes from there. After the seeds were collected, they were cleaned and processed in Turkey and shipped to the US into Seattle, where they were held at the customs for a while. They eventually made it through, and the seed went down to Kintai Mountain Home Nursery in Springfield, Oregon, where they were germinated, grown, until we were ready for packing. So they were grown there for 2 years. And we went down and inventoried them and knew what we had to work with. Then the packing occurred, and then shipping to the 5 regional areas, 10 different sites. That all happened in winter and spring of 2013. Then there were ongoing evaluations through the years. Superior trees were identified and grafted, and then harvesting will begin. It has in some of the locations, but for the Northwest, we were lucky they still are standing. So the trial trees that ended up being part of this large progeny trial included 18 different sources from this particular region. So all total for Turkish, there were about 56, I believe, sources. We had about 34 Trojan, and then there were some standards that were included, and Nordman's, Nobles, Balsam, White, Fraser, Grand, Korean, and Turkish from a local source. That made up the sources for the whole trial. So packing went on down at Kintai. There were crews that came in from North Carolina, Michigan, Washington, and Chal and myself. I want to say we had about 10 people at least, and it took us a good part of 2 days, I believe, to get them all sorted and packed. What that entailed was taking the seedlings and packing them in, or tagging them first with their ID tags, and that was majorly important, as you might imagine. They had barcoded the source IDs on there as well. We packaged them into groups of 10, put them into the boxes for each source. Then we had to make sure that the sources were divided up for each of the 10 sites, and that everybody got, every source. So it was quite a fun 2 days. There's a closer picture of some of the seedlings. It looks like source 25, which was headed out. So we packaged them all up. They went in the truck and they went off to their destinations. So I'm going to be talking about more in depth about the Northwest plantings. There was one in Washington at the Nisqually site. It was planted in the spring of 2013, and it's outlined here. 3,000 seedlings in there. And this picture over here is of this Oregon site. It was in the sublimity area. And again, 3,000 seedlings. We had 30 reps, a complete random block design. So each one of those reps had a representative of each one of those sources in there. They were planted at 5-foot spacings. Here's a picture at planting going on at the Oregon site in February. This site was generously offered up by Jim Heater of Silver Mountain Christmas Trees at the time. We had a hired crew of about 12 people that helped plant. Several OSU people were there, Chal and myself. We had to organize, make sure each rep got the right boxes, the right amount of individual seedlings, marking the reps, lots of map checking. So the next thing that happened over the many years was different site evaluations. They started they started months after the planting, and with health condition, what survived, what didn't. This went on yearly. We looked at general health, whether they were live, dead, like I said, diseases, any animal damage. We looked at bud break timings 3 different times throughout the trials in both Washington and Oregon. Washington, I believe, actually did it bud break timing every year since 2014. We did it 3 different times, 2014, 17, and 19, I believe. And then we did lots of height and structural and condition evaluations throughout the growing season. Structural looked at growing features like branches, density, how many branches in the upper whorls, leader structure, whether there were several leaders or the branches in the top whorls were turning up, buds, just anything that would, desirable in a Christmas tree was evaluated several times. So after looking at our data from that, we picked the best trees. And in 2017, 2019, we sent our best trees up to have post-harvest needle loss evaluations done. And Gary Chastagner did those up in Puyallup. He has a team that sets up the little branch tips that we send them. We send them little laterals off unpruned, which was challenging, off a particular part of the tree with the current season growth, last year's growth. And we send these small little branchlets up to him off our best trees. He sets them up, his team does, in a controlled room that mimics a home environment, 68 degrees Fahrenheit. And then from there, at various timings, like 2 days after setting it up, 4 days, a week, and so on, they rank the needles falling off, the percentage of that. So that's quite involved, and Gary has a lot of data on that. And this actually, to the right here, is a picture of the Washington site in 2019. That was Kenny Schultz, Nisqually Tree Farm site. And you'll see some pictures of some big trees there a little further in the presentation too. So back to more evaluations. For the bud break, that was done 3 times in both our orchards, and I think more often up in Puyallup. After 90% of the buds had opened in the field, just at least opened, we went in and scored every single tree out there. We recruited whoever we could to help. A lot of growers helped us with that. It was greatly appreciated. But it was really important data. So like the picture over here to the right, that is probably a 2. It's not a perfect system because sometimes there's a variation on there. So you kind of have to go with the best guess. And you look at the same side of the tree, the same area. So you're consistent on that. But we would give it a score based on what you see here, and then move from there. So this would be like a 3. They're still kind of brushy. They're just breaking out. And this one, they're 1 to 2 inches long, kind of fluffy, but still very soft. So those are just a couple examples. So we did that several times, very time consuming, as you might imagine. So the Oregon site had some issues with critters. We had deer, which wasn't nearly as bad as the gopher. The gopher chewed on a lot of roots in the first couple years of the project, which was unfortunate because it did a lot of damage and the trees suffered. And we noticed that from years following. And here's kind of a picture that explains that a little better. So this tree right in the foreground is looking pretty decent. I think it's a Trojan fir, in fact. And you can see the yellowing in small trees. This was actually taken in 2017. So these should be, quite a bit bigger than that. And you can see sporadically throughout the field, there's some okay trees, but a lot of them, this was kind of just a really hot spot in the field for gophers. We got some professional gopher killers in there and pretty much took care of it after we first spotted it, but it was devastating to a lot of the trees. So, so some general broad conclusions for the Northwest sites. The Trojan from the Cause region performed well at both sites. They had good branch structure, they grew fast, all of those parameters that we were looking for in the evaluations. They had good leaders, lots of branching in the upper whorls, and they were great trees. The Trojan from the Can region were also nice trees. I don't think they were quite as tall, generally speaking, but they had excellent needle retention, and the cause sources had good needle retention as well. The Turkish had great needle retention from the Kar region, and so did several other of the Turkish. There was a lot of variance in height and size, but we had some outstanding individual trees from many of those areas. A generalization on bud break was that Trojan fir breaks bud very early in the season, earlier than any of the other trees. So that can be a problem if, for growers in very cold regions. So at any rate, it shouldn't be much of a problem here in the valley, but it could be. The Nordman fir that were included in the trial were some of the slower growing than some of the other 3 sources of the Nordman that we used. And it was found that, no surprise, that the noble fir was outstanding in a lot of the evaluations. It was right up there with some of the newer species. Same way with the Grands did pretty well. There were a few that took some hard hits and got a little bit of needle necrosis, but we had some really nice individual trees. Here's a picture at Nisqually just from last month. We were up there. We met with Gary and his team. He had a group of probably 8 people that we helped, and we did a final evaluation on some trees that were picked by the grower as superior trees. Now, these have all been sheared as Christmas trees, and the Oregon sites, they were done the same, but you can see how beautiful the trees up there turned out. So we were fortunate they didn't cut them all. They cut a few. You can see some stumps. So harvest had begun, but most of the ones we wanted to evaluate were still there. So this is a Trojan fir, number 75, and over here is one of the nicer Turkish fir from, I forget which region right now, but it's number 42. And there were just a couple examples of some really nice trees we saw up there. So the best of the best from all those evaluations went up, were needle tested in Washington with Gary, and the ones that scored very good on needle retention were the ultimate grand prize winners. So from Washington and from Oregon, we collected scion and grafted those trees into the first Trojan fir orchard at the North Willamette Research and Extension Center. We have about 38 trees. We didn't have a lot of space, but we grafted them. I grafted them onto Turkish rootstock, and so those are doing well there. And then all these same sources here are also grafted into a couple brand new orchards at grower sites in the valley. And that's an example of I think that's just a 1 season growth of, you can see the graft right there, kind of where that blank spot is. That was done on some pretty big trees. They were 5, 6, 7 foot trees that we grafted a couple years ago. So they are doing well. And again, with the Turkish, the best of the best, and they had to have great needle retention to make that list, as well as all those other physical features, were grafted into orchards at North Willamette and 2 other grower sites. So we've got a lot of good starts to seed orchards out there. We've got scion sources for more orchards if people are interested. And over the years, hopefully these will be producing soon. I think North Willamettes have been in the longest, but some of these grower sites, they're really taking off and growing. So who knows, maybe within 10 years or sooner, we'll have some cones coming off of them. Some of the Turkish at North Willamette actually did, I had 2 trees last year that had about 10 cones total on it. So nothing exciting yet, but so with the end of the Coforge 1 trial, we're moving on to Coforge 2, which is kind of a tag on the next edition of Coverage 1. So we're taking the top 12 Trojan sources from that Coverage 1 trial and retesting them, collecting more seed. It was collected in 2020. And we're adding some Nordman families to hopefully find maybe some more sources that will grow really well here, with later bud break possibly, just maybe faster growing, just looking at Nordman again to find some new standards there. So to compare, we are comparing them with some domestic seed orchard check lots that were donated and some imported seed from Denmark. We also have the Christmas Tree Promotion Board is a major funder of this Coverage project. And seeds have already been collected and they are up. Oh, let's see. They were up being grown as we speak. That's my next slide. But in the meantime, here was some of the standards that I was going to show you. So the Danish seed, some Nordmans, some domestic Turkish that are great sources, and the Balsam, Canaan, Fraser, and this really outstanding Noble. Those will all be used to compare to what was collected in Turkey and the Republic of Georgia. So the seed went up to Silva, and it came all in early in the year, got it all up there. They are growing it, and here's a picture over to the right. A lot of them are doing really well. There were some that didn't germinate well, so that could be a problem. Some of the check lots are doing really well, and they're very large. And so the final inventory will determine how many reps, how many sites. We may have to sub in some other, I don't know how that's going to work, but we'll need a final inventory to see what we're working with. But the idea is to have this again across 11 or 12 sites in the major US growing areas. And it's slated to be planted in spring of 2023. So a little over a year from now, well, year and a half. So the only other thing I could say about the Coverage trials is the fact that Coverage 1 still has some trees standing. We're going to make sure that we look over our data, and if we have any room in any orchards, if there's anything else that might be a good tree to include, we're going to make sure we have them all before they all get cut down. So moving on to the heat dome event. Everybody knows about it or has heard about it. It took place in late June. The super high temps in the valley of 118. We saw damage across most lower elevation sites in the valley. And it was very site specific. We're finding out as the summer went on and the fall that, you know, depending on your site, it depends on the specific exposure. If it was it's on a southwest exposure with a direct sun, it got a lot more damaged, and it was very hard on the seedlings, as Chal mentioned. So typical damage observed by species. The noble fir was very variable, but damage to leaders, also to the new growth, but a lot of the year before's growth. So 2020 growth, as you saw in that last picture. Let me go back. So yeah, you can see over to the right. So this was the current growth out on the edge, but this was the 2020 growth that was brown. Was more pronounced on the sunny side of the tree. Grand fir had similar variable kind of damage as well as the nobles. It was pretty similar. Nordman and Turkish fir mainly had a lot of drooping and necrotic, like dead leaders. Some had terminal branch tips that were droopy and dead as well. Douglas fir seemed to do pretty well. Some light scorching on the sunniest side. Not really any leader damage seen, and the seedlings of Douglas fir fared a lot better from what we saw than noble fir. noble fir, a lot, like Chal had mentioned, a lot of growers lost 50 to 70% of their newly planted noble firs. So we won't really know the impacts of everything until, time goes on. Next year, the nobles may look better. The taller trees, the more harvest ready trees, we'll see how they do with those brown needles. And the economic impacts, as that's yet to be seen. How will the harvest be affected, and seedling availability to replant all those dead seedlings? Well, it's just, well, time will tell. So here's more just pictures of damage, and these are at our orchards at the North Willamette. So we don't have sheared trees there, so we have a lot of more branch formations, and so you can see the dead last 2020 season needles. Here's some droopy newest foliage, newest needle damage, and then there's that kind of just showing the south side of the tree over there that got it a whole lot more than the other side. Our Nordman and Turkish showed damage. There's some floppy leaders, and that was really what happened on the Trojan as well. The Trojan, it was pretty tough. The trees are about 3 to 4 feet tall, most of the newly grafted Trojans, and there were just a few that had slight leader damage, nothing that severe, but this was typical of Turkish that we saw out in cultured Christmas tree fields as well. Here's some of our Douglas fir, and these are large trees, but this was the worst I could find. So it was very minimal at our orchards at North Willamette. Chal went out to a few grower sites, and these are some pictures he took. You can see the distorted leaders on these and the upper whorls. The branches are distorted, and we'll just have to see if those straighten out, if these need to be cut, if these actually died. I've already cut a few off at North Willamette that were dead. You can see the south side of the tree again on the noble to the right. Like I mentioned, the young trees really suffered. Here's a Turkish fir that really, the south side got pretty damaged. It'll probably live. It'll just, who knows how much that will be set back. And then here's a cross between a Korean and a Lasiocarpa seedling, and it's probably dead. And it even had a shade on it. So we'll have to see what that does next year. Again, young trees. Here's some dead nobles that we were out and saw in October. These had been planted, and it actually rained right after planting in March, but it didn't really save those. Here's a Nordman that was a 3-year-old. Again, it'll probably survive, but it's going to be severely set back, which will, take more years to get it to harvest. On the noble over here, this grower had mulched some rows next to it, and he did have better survival, as Chal had talked a little bit about that. Mortality was reduced quite a bit, almost 20%, by using the mulch, and that's all he did. There was no irrigation, so that was promising. I mean, too bad he didn't do it to all of them. Let's see, and I think that's my short but sweet. I think I went okay on my time. Let's see where I'm at here. Yeah, let me get to the next slide. I thank you guys for allowing me to present here, and hopefully you got a little idea of what the biggest progeny trial that Chal has undertaken with collaborators was all about. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Judy. That's just so great to see all of that research that you all do. It's just intense, like measuring all of those tips. My goodness.
Yeah, that was a lot, measuring 3,000 trees, the height,
boy.
the 5 different parameters on it, and then going back in the spring and doing the bud break. So
my goodness. Yeah, hooray for scientists. Yay.
Yeah, fun to be out in the trees though, so that's a bonus.
Great. Well, everybody, we've reached our Q&A session here. So I do have a few questions from one of our participants here. Judy and Chal, if you want to turn on your camera also, if you guys want to talk about this. We go until 4:30 today. And, if our conversation should happen to keep continuing, we will hang out until about 4:45 today to make sure that your questions get answered. We do have one final poll for you. So before we get our or while we're talking about our questions and answers, I'm going to go ahead and launch that poll. Please take that at your convenience. We're not going to be sharing that. You have all the time in the world to take this poll. We just want to know a little bit more about your experience here today. I just wanted to call your attention to our next webinar that's coming up in a month in 2021. Tree School Online moves into, 2022. Wow, my first time goofing that up. Tree School Online moves into 2022. So there's going to be a question getting to know your forest amphibians of Oregon. So please remember to come back and tune in for that. Okay, so while you're taking that poll, I have a couple of questions here I will ask you. And I think, Judy, this has to do with you. This was asked during your presentation. When do you expect, they were talking about, so the question is from Tom, and he's asking about Trojan and Turkish firs. So what is the standard number of years to grown from seedling to a standard, 6 to 7 foot tree? Is that gonna, do you know off the top of your head for that one?
Well, since we haven't done that yet, Chal might have a better idea, but the Trojan were pretty fast growing. I guess we have done it in the trial. So what would you say, Chal? 8 years?
It's a good question, Tom. The noble fir comparator in the site at in Oregon, we were probably, the Trojan fir was pretty close to the same growth as noble. Yeah. The Turkish was about probably a year slower, and Nordman slower than that. So pretty close to nobles on the site with the Trojan.
Great. And then Tom has all these questions for you. So Tom is really interested in this here. Good for you, Tom. So when do you expect those seeds to be available for the common grower, do you think? And Tom, I hope you meant that you were talking about the Trojans and the Turkish first there.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, Tom. I think if we had some extras, there's a seed producer in New York. If you want to call me, I can give you his number. He had some seed left over from our collection, so a grower could get seed from him. All of the stuff that we collected has been given out to nurseries. So a few nurseries in the Northwest should have some Trojan in 2 years. But as far as seed, send me an email to remind me, and I'll send you the name of the seed dealer in New York.
Great. Yeah, and we'll be sure to include our. You can. I think we have access to your emails, and if not, folks can look you up on the OSU extension or OSU guide there. But I'm pretty sure we'll have your email address for folks so they can send that out to you. Okay, these are a couple more questions here from Tom. So I'm wanting to hear more about the llamas growth in the late summer that appeared near the sun damaged areas, and just a follow up there. Or then here's more on the heat dome too. Wondering if you could talk about any of the impacts that cover crops or weed control had on those seedling survival. So the first one there is about that llamas growth.
Well, Chal, what did you see any llamas growth that took off after on your farm?
On my farm, the llamas growth that I had was on that Trojan or the Korean Lasiocarpa cross, and it was pretty well fried. So the damage was very strongly related to the kind of the bud break timing of when the trees were real succulent. So the trees that were later bud breaking sources tended to be damaged the worst simply because of the timing of the heat dome. I don't think it's unique to the species themselves as much as it was for the timing of the heat dome and where they were at. Cover crops was the next question that you had, and certainly John Tillman, you and another grower in Washington were showing less damage with the cover crops on your field. We have cover crops at all the sites at North Willamette, and so we couldn't compare sites that didn't have cover crops with sites with cover crops. On my own field, you know, it didn't seem to make any difference about whether or not, you know, the cover crops on my farm didn't make any difference. But I want to preface that comment with the fact that my farm is near Scappoose, which had the highest temperatures from the heat dome. So yours was a little bit colder, a little bit cooler, if 114 is cooler. But we were up to 117 and 18. So the cover crops didn't seem to make any difference, but you know, John Tillman, you and 2 or 3 other growers have mentioned that the cover crops seem to really mitigate that kind of lower branch damage on their fields. So good for you.
Wonderful. Well, that was the last of our questions, folks. We do have 1 minute here if you want to type it in quickly there. If not, thank you, speakers, so much. It was so great to hear from you, Chal and Judy. Just really enjoyed hearing all of that research you've been doing, and just I have so many questions myself and the forest health background, and I'm curious about those twig beetles and the heat dome, in fact, and all that stuff. So I'll be checking out your research and and be looking for some updates on all those great things.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Yes, you're welcome. As a reminder, all of the resources that were shared today are available on the Tree School online website at knowyourforest.org. And Lauren did post that ALO logging credits are available, and the link was posted there. So thank you all for coming, and we'll hopefully see you next month at our next Tree School Online. Take care, everybody.
Thanks.